one rein to each horse, and it goes straight through from here to the outside of each horse.
When we would go carriage driving, well, first of all, he'd take me on a different route every day, and I do not know how he managed to do that.
In the carefully choreographed world of the British royal family, where every public appearance is calculated and every inheritance carries centuries of symbolism, a quiet revolution has been taking place behind the gilded doors of Windsor Castle. While the world watched Prince Harry wage his very public war against the institution, while commentators dissected every photograph of William and Catherine, and while King Charles navigated the complex transition from prince to sovereign, a young woman was working a summer shift at a garden centre in Surrey, largely unbothered by the weight of her surname. Her name is Lady Louise Windsor. She is 21 years old. And according to multiple royal sources and estate analysts, she may have quietly become one of the most significant inheritors in the modern history of the House of Windsor. This is not a story about crowns or palaces. It is a story about a grandmother's love, a grandfather's legacy, a palace divided, and a woman named Camilla Parker Bowles whose family is said to be quietly furious about all of it. Stay with us, because the details are extraordinary. To understand what Lady Louise has inherited, and why it matters, you first need to understand who she is, because the British public and much of the world has been almost deliberately kept in the dark about her. Lady Louise Alice Elizabeth Mary Mountbatten Windsor was born on the 8th of November 2003, at Frimley Park Hospital in Surrey. Her birth was anything but routine. Her mother, Sophie, then the Countess of Wessex, suffered a severe placental abruption, a sudden and dangerous separation of the placenta from the uterine wall, requiring an emergency caesarean section. Both mother and daughter came close to losing their lives. Louise was premature and fragile, rushed to the neonatal unit at St. George's Hospital in London. Her father, Prince Edward, the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II, was travelling abroad at the time and did not make it to the hospital for her birth. For Queen Elizabeth, this was not an abstract news item. This was her granddaughter, fighting for her life in an incubator. Sources close to the palace, including those cited in royal biographers' accounts over the years, have consistently noted that the near tragedy of Louise's birth triggered a fierce and lasting protectiveness in the Queen, a bond that would quietly deepen over the next 2 decades. Louise's early years brought further challenges. She was diagnosed with esotropia, a form of squinting where the eyes turn inward, and underwent multiple corrective surgeries during childhood. These early medical battles, navigated largely away from public attention, were handled with characteristic dignity by Edward and Sophie, and were observed closely and compassionately by the Queen. The contrast with her more famous cousins could hardly have been more striking. William and Harry were already global celebrities before they could drive. Louise grew up in the relative privacy of Bagshot Park, a 120-room mansion in Surrey, attending St. George's School at Windsor Castle and later St. Mary's School, Ascot, for her A-levels, where she studied English, history, politics, and drama. She did not have a royal protection officer assigned to her as a child. She was not regularly photographed. She worked a summer job at a garden centre before heading to university. And according to multiple sources who have spoken to royal correspondents over the years, Queen Elizabeth loved her for all of it. Royal correspondent Joe Little, the managing editor of Majesty magazine, has noted on several occasions that Lady Louise occupied a uniquely tender place in Queen Elizabeth's heart. The reasons, he has suggested, were both personal and practical. Louise was the youngest granddaughter. She had a fragile beginning. She grew up without the entitled glare of the spotlight. And critically, she treated her grandmother simply as her grandmother, not as the head of state, not as a constitutional monarch, not as a symbol of 1,000 years of British history. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, recounted a telling story in interviews. When young Louise came home one day confused and slightly bewildered, she told her mother, "Mummy, people keep saying that Grandma is the Queen." Sophie asked her how that made her feel. Louise replied simply, "I don't understand." She didn't understand because at home, in the private spaces of family life, Grandma was just Grandma. That was it. That was everything. For a woman who had spent her entire conscious life being treated as an institution rather than a person, Queen Elizabeth reportedly found this simplicity intoxicating. Royal journalist Rebecca English, writing for the Daily Mail, recalled accounts from palace staff describing how the Queen would visit Edward and Sophie's home near Windsor, or have Louise and her brother James visit her, specifically to watch the children's television program Mr. Tumble together. The image of Queen Elizabeth II, the most famous woman on the planet, the longest-reigning British monarch in history, Sitting on a sofa watching children's television with her grandchildren is both improbable and deeply moving. But it also explains everything that comes next. In a family filled with complexity, scandal, estrangement, and centuries of obligation, Louise represented something the Queen rarely found within the Windsor walls: uncomplicated love. A palace insider told various royal journalists in 2019 that the Queen appeared to genuinely favor Louise and her brother James over her older grandchildren during the long summer holidays at Balmoral. Observers noted that Louise was particularly gifted with the younger children in the family. She patiently taught Princess Charlotte to draw rabbits and deer. She was described as gentle, warm, and naturally at ease, traits the Queen recognized and admired. Because of Louise's artistic inclinations, the Queen is said to have granted her special access to Queen Victoria's private Highland sketches, drawings that were rarely shared with anyone outside the most intimate royal circles. That detail alone speaks volumes about the depth of trust Elizabeth placed in her youngest granddaughter. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, died on the 9th of April 2021 at Windsor Castle. He was 99 years old. His funeral was a global event watched by tens of millions, a ceremony stripped back to its essentials by the pandemic restrictions of the time, and yet unforgettable. Among the most poignant images of that day were two fell ponies, Balmoral Nevis and Knotlaw Storm, standing beside a dark green carriage outside St. George's Chapel. On the carriage seat sat Philip's driving gloves, his cap, his whip, and a small red tub of sugar lumps for his horses. Those ponies, that carriage, and all the equipment associated with Philip's beloved carriage driving were left by the Duke not to his children, not to the institution of the monarchy, but to his granddaughter, Lady Louise Windsor. To understand the significance of that decision, you need to understand what carriage driving meant to Prince Philip. Philip had been an accomplished polo player for decades, but by 1971, severe arthritis had made polo impossible. Rather than retreat from competitive sport, he turned to carriage driving, a far more technically demanding discipline than most people realize. He went on to represent Great Britain at 6 World Carriage Driving Championships and 3 European Championships. He competed into his 80s. He helped rewrite the rulebook of the sport on an international level. For Philip, carriage driving was not a hobby. It was an expression of his identity, his discipline, and his refusal to accept limitation. That he chose Lady Louise as the recipient of this legacy was no accident. Philip had personally taught Louise to drive a carriage during her teenage years. According to Sophie, speaking to reporters around 2020, Louise had a natural instinct for the sport, the kind of feel for horses and rhythm that cannot be easily taught. Philip and Louise spent long hours together in Windsor Great Park, training side by side. In 2019, Philip attended the Royal Windsor Horse Show to watch Louise compete in the private driving singles category. She placed third. Those who were present noted that Philip's pride was entirely visible. When he died and left her those ponies and that carriage, he was doing something that went far beyond an asset transfer. He was saying, "You are my successor in this. You carry this forward." Louise did exactly that. In 2022, she drove one of Philip's carriages at the Royal Windsor Horse Show as part of a commemorative parade. Queen Elizabeth watched from the stands. Multiple witnesses described the Queen with tears in her eyes. By 2024, Louise had competed at the British National Carriage Driving Championships, placing second in her class, competing under the name Mountbatten Windsor, the full royal family surname, as a clear statement of identity and lineage. Philip's inheritance was the opening chapter. What came from Elizabeth was the full story. Here is where most reporting on royal wealth becomes misleading, and it is important to be precise. Queen Elizabeth II was surrounded by approximately £28 billion in assets associated with the Crown Estate. But almost none of that was hers personally. The Crown Estate, which includes Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Kensington Palace, and vast tracts of land across the United Kingdom, is managed by an independent board and belongs to the monarchy as an institution, not to any individual monarch. It passes automatically from sovereign to sovereign. Elizabeth could no more leave Buckingham Palace to a grandchild than she could leave the Houses of Parliament. What Elizabeth personally owned was a separate and distinct portfolio, estimated by various financial analysts and royal commentators at approximately £500 million at the time of her death in September 2022. This personal estate included Balmoral Castle in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, purchased privately by Prince Albert in 1852 and passed down through the family ever since, estimated to be worth around £80 million. It included the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, valued at approximately £250 million. These were not crown properties. They were private family assets, purchased with private funds and owned outright by the monarch as an individual. Beyond real estate, Elizabeth's personal estate included over 300 pieces of fine jewelry that were specifically and exclusively hers, distinct from the crown jewels, which belonged to the nation. She owned a remarkable private collection of racehorses, built over decades through her passion for the turf. She maintained private investment portfolios. The full personal estate, when accounting for art, antiques, vehicles, horses, and financial instruments, was estimated by financial commentators to exceed £500 million. There is also an important legal dimension here. Under a 1993 agreement between the royal family and the British government, transfers of private royal wealth between sovereign and successor are exempt from the standard 40% inheritance tax that applies to most estates. This means that when Elizabeth's private wealth passed to King Charles, it passed in full, untaxed. However, and this is the critical point, Elizabeth retained the right to direct specific items, gifts, properties, and portions of her estate to whomever she chose. Not everything had to pass to Charles. Personal gifts, jewelry, specific bequests, items designated in a will, these could go to children, grandchildren, or anyone else she wished. Sources who spoke to various British media outlets in the months before and after Elizabeth's death in September 2022 indicated that she had spent considerable time in her final years reviewing her personal collection and making deliberate choices about who should receive what. The whisper from those sources was consistent. Some of those choices were surprising. And some of them were not going to be well received by everyone. The first and most publicly discussed element of the inheritance controversy concerned Queen Elizabeth's personal jewelry collection. Reports from multiple outlets, including accounts cited by Radar Online and discussed by royal correspondents in 2022 and 2023, indicated that the Queen directed approximately $110 million worth of her personal jewelry, from her 300-piece private collection, to Catherine, Princess of Wales. This was significant on multiple levels. The sheer monetary value was extraordinary. But perhaps more meaningful was the symbolism. Elizabeth was identifying Catherine as the future of the monarchy, the woman who would one day be queen, and the recipient of her most personal treasures. Catherine had worked for this relationship carefully and sincerely over many years. Those close to the palace noted a particular warmth between the two women in the final years of Elizabeth's life, a warmth built on shared values of duty, discretion, and genuine dedication to the institution. Elizabeth, who rarely gave her approval easily, is said to have found in Catherine exactly the qualities she valued most in a royal woman. Camilla, now queen consort, reportedly received far less from Elizabeth's personal estate. This was not a minor slight. This was a statement. To understand why, it helps to remember the full arc of the relationship between Elizabeth and Camilla. For decades, Camilla Parker Bowles was the other woman, the person Elizabeth held responsible, at least in part, for the collapse of the Prince and Princess of Wales's marriage, a collapse that produced one of the most damaging tabloid sagas in the monarchy's modern history. Elizabeth's eventual acceptance of Camilla, including her support for their marriage in 2005, was pragmatic rather than warm. It was the act of a constitutional monarch managing a difficult reality, not the act of a woman welcoming a beloved daughter-in-law. Sources cited by Radar Online in 2022 quoted an insider who stated plainly, "Kate is clearly the family favorite. She would never say it, but it's one reason Camilla resents Kate." Camilla's children from her first marriage, Tom Parker Bowles, a food writer and author, and Laura Lopez, an art curator, occupy an unusual position in the royal universe. They attend royal events. They are present at family occasions. But they do not carry royal blood. They are not in the line of succession. They will receive no royal title, no official designation, no constitutional standing. And they received, by all accounts, nothing from Queen Elizabeth's personal estate. This is the emotional core of the conflict that has been quietly simmering behind palace walls. To fully grasp the scale of what Lady Louise may inherit or has already received, you need to understand the remarkable rehabilitation, or more precisely, the quiet ascent, of Prince Edward and Sophie's branch of the royal family. Prince Edward is the youngest of Elizabeth's 4 children. He spent much of his adult life in the shadow of his more dramatic siblings, Charles, with his turbulent personal life, and, with her fierce independence and tendency to do things entirely on her own terms, and Andrew, whose association with Jeffrey Epstein created a scandal that shook the monarchy to its foundations. Edward, by contrast, built something the others struggled to maintain, a stable, dignified, Private family life. Sophie Rhys-Jones married Edward in 1999. She is consistently described by those who know the royal family well as the Queen's favorite daughter-in-law, an assessment that places her above even Catherine in terms of the personal relationship with the late Queen. Sophie earned that designation through 2 decades of loyal, diligent, and largely unheralded royal service. After stepping back from her PR career in 2002, she became a full-time working royal, eventually patron of over 70 charities and a tireless advocate for causes ranging from women's health to tackling avoidable blindness globally. More than her charity work, Sophie understood instinctively what Elizabeth valued most: discretion, reliability, and putting the institution before the individual. When palace courtiers talk about the Wessex family model, now the Edinburgh family model, following the 2023 dukedom, they describe it as the template for how a modern royal family should operate. When King Charles bestowed the dukedom of Edinburgh on his brother Edward in 2023, it was widely interpreted as a formal recognition of that trust. The title carries enormous historical and sentimental weight. It was Philip's title for more than 7 decades. Giving it to Edward was a profound act of institutional confidence. And into this family, this trusted, stable, discretion-first family, Lady Louise was born and raised. In September 2022, just days after standing at her grandmother's funeral with the composure of someone decades older, Lady Louise Windsor began her undergraduate degree in English at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. The choice of university was noted immediately. St Andrews is where Prince William met Catherine Middleton. It is where their relationship began. It carries royal weight. But Louise's choice of subject, English literature, and her subsequent decisions suggested a young woman following her own intellectual compass rather than a prescribed royal playbook. In 2024, Louise made a decision that surprised royal observers considerably. She joined the Tayforth University Officer Training Corps, a British Army Reserve unit affiliated with the University of St Andrews. Photographs emerged of her in military fatigues, helmet marked clearly with Windsor, training alongside her university peers. She appeared entirely at ease, neither seeking nor avoiding attention. By 2025, she had progressed to the rank of officer cadet in the Army Reserve. The parallel with her grandmother was impossible to miss. At 16, Queen Elizabeth began her first official public duty, inspecting troops at Windsor Castle during the Second World War. At 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, becoming the first female member of the royal family to serve actively in the armed forces. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams, speaking to various media outlets, has noted that Louise appears to combine traits from both her grandparents, Elizabeth's natural shyness and sense of duty, and Philip's competitive spirit and physical determination. Her LinkedIn profile, which she maintained like any other university student, pointed toward interests in the military, diplomacy, and law. These are not the interests of someone who plans to retreat from public life. These are the building blocks of a working royal, or, more broadly, of someone who intends to be consequential. Fitzwilliams and others have noted the increasingly urgent question of working royals. The monarchy, under King Charles, is a smaller, leaner institution than it was a decade ago. With Harry's exit and the complications surrounding Andrew, the pool of working royals is shallow. There are, as multiple commentators have observed, very few members of the royal family under 70 who are both willing and positioned to take on significant public duties. Louise is one of them, and she appears to be preparing herself accordingly. Let us now bring this together and state plainly what the available evidence suggests. Queen Elizabeth spent the last years of her life making deliberate personal decisions about her estate that reflected her genuine feelings about the people in her family. Those decisions were not random. They were not merely financial. They were expressions of love, trust, and, in some cases, pointed exclusion. Philip left his most prized possessions, his horses, his carriage, the tangible expression of his competitive passion, to Louise. Not to Charles. Not to the institution. To Louise. Elizabeth directed vast personal jewelry to Catherine, bypassing Camilla entirely in terms of personal gifts of real significance. And in the broader pattern of her final years, Elizabeth drew closest to Edward and Sophie's family. The visits to watch children's television. The access to Victoria's private sketches. The intimacy of Balmoral. The title bestowed posthumously through Charles. These were not coincidences. For Camilla, watching all of this, the frustration is described by sources as significant. She is queen consort. She is married to the king. She has the title, the access, the position. But Queen Elizabeth's personal choices made clear, with all the eloquence of deliberate silence, where the late Queen's true loyalties and affections lay. Reports have circulated that Camilla has sought to influence King Charles's own will and estate planning in ways that would benefit her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez. Whether those reports are accurate is difficult to verify from outside the palace. What is not difficult to verify is the structural reality. Tom and Laura are not in the line of succession, do not hold royal titles, and their position in the long-term royal story depends entirely on Charles's personal choices and Camilla's influence over them. Lady Louise Windsor, by contrast, is 17th in line to the throne. She is the granddaughter of both Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. She has received tangible personal gifts from both grandparents. She is pursuing an education and military career that suggests serious institutional ambitions. And she has the inestimable advantage of being, by all accounts, genuinely and deeply loved by the people who raised her and shaped her. There is a broader story here, beyond the personal dramas and the inheritance figures. Queen Elizabeth spent 70 years on the throne. She saw everything. She understood, with the wisdom of lived experience, that institutions survive not because of their grandeur but because of the quality of the people who carry them forward. She saw which members of her family were genuinely committed to service. She saw which ones understood sacrifice. She saw which ones treated the monarchy as a privilege rather than a burden. Her choices in her final years reflected that understanding. Catherine, who gave up a private life to become what the institution needed her to be, was rewarded with the most personal and precious of gifts. Edward and Sophie, who built a quiet life of dignity and service, were rewarded with elevated status and trust. And Louise, who worked at a garden center, who drove a carriage at Windsor with tears in the crowd, who enrolled in officer training alongside ordinary university students, is positioned, quietly and without fanfare, as one of the monarchy's most interesting figures for the generation ahead. Camilla's family, watching from a position of proximity without full belonging, sees all of this. And the frustration, according to those who have spoken to royal journalists, is real. But in the British royal family, as Elizabeth demonstrated over and over again throughout her extraordinary life, it is not those who loudest seek power who tend to receive it. It is those who earn trust through consistency, humility, and genuine dedication to something larger than themselves. Lady Louise Windsor is 21 years old. She has a degree to finish, a military career to explore, and decades of choices ahead of her. She has not sought the spotlight. She has not written a memoir, given explosive interviews, or courted controversy. What she has done is show up, for her grandmother, for her grandfather, for her family, and for the institution that will define the Windsor name long after the current generation has passed. Queen Elizabeth's personal choices in her final years were not accidental. They were the considered judgments of a woman who spent 7 decades reading people, institutions, and the long arc of history. She saw something in Louise that she recognized and valued. And in the quiet inheritance of a pair of fell ponies, a dark green carriage, and a relationship built around children's television and Victorian sketches, she said something that no official announcement, no palace press release, and no royal decree could have expressed more honestly. This is the one I trust. This is the one I love. This is the one.